Hello. From October 4th to 10th, we celebrate National Catholic Healthcare Week across Canada. It's an opportunity to recognize the inspiring work of Catholic healthcare organizations in our province and nationwide. This year, the COVID-19 pandemic transformed our healthcare landscape and society. In Canada, the pandemic has shone a public light on many important social and ethical issues, calling us to reflect on the importance of human connection, quality of life, and the meaning of well-being. In this interview, Dr. Gordon Self, Chief Mission and Ethics Officer at Covenant Health, and clinical ethicist Dr. Eleanor Stewart share their thoughts on the impact and challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. They also reflect on the mission of Covenant Health to continue the healing ministry of Jesus by serving with compassion, upholding the sacredness of life in all stages, and caring for the whole person, body, mind, and soul.
Well, in terms of title, I'm the Chief Mission and Ethics Officer, and I think it's really providing that leadership at an executive level regarding our culture in terms of our commitment to ethics, clinical and organizational ethics, and our support of an integration of Catholic social teaching and a health ethics guide in all our decision making. So there's an obvious clinical sort of component in healthcare in terms of bedside care, withdrawing, withholding treatment, etc. And Eleanor is really the person that can really speak to that. But there's also business decisions that we make, financial decisions that also are very much values infused. And so we want to make decisions consistent with who we say we are. And COVID is just an example where a lot of those difficult decisions were challenged, that we needed to look at how we approach this based on our identity. And I play a role in helping support some of that conversation and decision making in the organization.
And Eleanor?
Yes, and so I'm one of two clinical ethicists in Covenant. And so primarily my colleague John and I are there to respond to clinical ethics consults. That's our sort of primary focus. However, we are involved in, we support committees. We have ethics committees where we draw people from across the organization so that we have perspectives and knowledge when we are discussing difficult cases. And also it's part of a view that we have of preventative ethics. So having influence across the organization by educating and supporting our committee members who then fan out and are influenced in their clinical areas across our organization. And right now we have an interesting project where we have a small core group of 6 individuals who are sort of in a way being trained up. We meet with them bi-weekly, and they have become our first responders to clinical ethics consults, and they represent facilities across Covenant, so not just urban but rural as well. We do a lot of, John and I do a lot of education when we're called out to individual clinical areas. And so the topic that has been percolating through COVID has been the moral distress that has really come to the forefront.
What is that exactly?
So moral distress is a form of moral injury whereby the individual clinician knows what the right thing is to do, but is prevented from doing it because of larger issues, because of policies, or because of disagreement on a team. And the person is left with a feeling that they have violated their own values, or values that they hold dearly. It's a threat to your integrity that leads you to ask questions like, what kind of doctor am I that I would do this? Why did I stand by while something happened here and I didn't speak up? It's a real terrible feeling that I had one psychiatrist say to me, because the only thing that he could do in this situation was to medicate his patient, but he wasn't medicating his patient for the benefit of the patient. He was doing it to protect others. And he felt like, what kind of doctor am I that I would do this injury to my patient, even though the circumstances seem to look like that was the only option. This has been really difficult. Visitor restrictions have triggered moral distress. It's a very difficult situation for a clinician to experience this, because then they question their humanity, their sense of being a good person.
That's a really great example, Eleanor, around visitor restrictions. So, in fact, we put together a series called "What Did I Sign Up For?" and it was actually borrowed from a physician's comment about, like, this is not what we signed up for. And from a palliative point of view, from an end of life, best practice, the family is an integral part of the patient. They are an extension of the patient, and so when you have to balance medical officer health requirements in terms of visit restrictions, knowing that, that person may not have access to their loved one, for just given the isolation that COVID has brought to bear. And then at the end of life, how many, people can come and visit and say goodbye. Like, all those things have been just a challenge, because we're trying to balance the good of an individual with a collective or communal good. And it's not always easy. And these are all really bright, smart, thoughtful, compassionate people, but we're trying to mitigate spread of COVID-19. But by doing that, that means that some of those things that we've always held dear and core may be challenged. And that's sort of like, and this is not unique to Covenant. You just look at the literature, you see this reflected in lots of commentaries around the world in terms of having to put in place very strict practices or guidelines, and then in order to kind of prevent a worse, a greater sort of injury, loss of life, et cetera. And you can just see like how virulent the novel coronavirus is. And when you have an outbreak in a facility, I mean, you're a news reporter, you would know how it can run amok in an organization. So that's what, you could look at yourself and say, how am I living with this? But then you imagine that conversation with family members who've lost loved ones as a result of a spread within a site. And that's also would be morally challenging. So that's just a good example, but it's not unique.
How is it, just picking up on that example in palliative care, for example, situation, how does that raise moral questions? I mean, this, just to be blunt, the doctors are trained to do this. Don't they have to have a certain dispassion to say, this is what the situation is? And, however I feel about it, it has to be done for the greater health of the community.
I'll just have a quick example, and then Eleanor, I know you can jump in on that. There were a number of cases that I was involved with where the person who was dying was like a younger, a young adult, like a young parent. And then their children were quite young, like early teens, as an example. And at one point, there were restrictions on anybody under 18 being able to visit the facility. So there's a need to make a prudential judgment that's also in keeping with our teaching within Catholic teaching, et cetera, the cardinal virtue of prudence. And so making a prudential decision about when that would be morally obligated, demanded of us to allow for sort of an exception in this case, because to deny that parent, access to their 12-year-old kid to say goodbye, like, that's unconscionable. But at the same time, if you open it all up and all kids running around the facility, that could create a whole nother kind of challenge. So I thought that was a good example. It's something that we dealt with a lot during this period. You think of sometimes it's the elderly dying, but while COVID's unfolding, we still have people coming in for surgery. We still have people having that's the other thing around when it came in early days of COVID, the role of doulas or surrogate parents, where it's not always just a nuclear family having a kid. Sometimes it's these complex family relationships, but we're saying you can only have, the birth mother and the father in the case room, but that doesn't always fit with, the reality in which family life presents itself. So it was those types of challenges that we had to kind of think our way through and try to be consistent, so we're treating like situations in like manner. Anyways, I'll pause there.
And Dr. Self, in that example that you used of a mother who had who was dying and had a you said a 12-year-old.
Well, I just used as an example. There was parents of both genders and young kids, etc. Yeah, even younger. There was one where they're under 10.
Were in those cases was the dying parent dying of COVID?
No, they just would have been in care.
Okay.
We talk about collateral damage. So you have people who are in care that might be exposed, but for the most part, there was limited exposure of COVID within our facilities. But as I said, on any given day, people are having surgery, people are dying of cancer, people have other emergency care done. And normally, as part of normal practice, to support a person or someone living in residential care, senior, as part of normal practice, the role of family and supporting them, bringing in food, singing hymns or just a presence. But with COVID, we had to kind of lock all that down. That's what became very difficult. So the example of just somebody dying of, some form of cancer, as an example, there would be restrictions in terms of how many people could visit. And it was evolving. We benefit from time, but we have to kind of put ourselves in that moment. And so in the early days of COVID, and we're still learning so much, but at one point, we would say that anybody under 18, and then there would be like, okay, they can be, I think initially we're talking about the last 2 weeks of life versus the last 2 days of life, as best that can be determined. And so they had to kind of broaden. Initially, some sites or some orders were requiring or allowing visitors in if it was expected that the person would pass away within 2 to 3 days or something like that. And then it kind of got broadened because it just wasn't realistic. Mm-hmm. So it's just those types of challenges.
Can I just, Andrew, go back to that point that you made about objectivity, or that, the sort of objectivity, and I understand that because I trained as a speech pathologist, and so as a student more than almost 40 years ago, that was exactly how I was taught. But medical ethics and health professions have evolved since then, with the recognition that we bring ourselves to the situation as well. And so what we talk about in medical ethics now is the empathetic response. So, there's a lot of work done in from that detachment to empathy. And one of the things that I think we do well in Catholic health is we are called to a mission. So therefore we are called as individuals to bring ourselves to the situation. And that's one of the attractions for me that I chose to work in Catholic health, because it calls me to be who I am and to bring all of myself to it. And I think that, you have to be skilled about that. I mean, it's certainly about boundaries, but I'm human. And I recently had a consult that was just really difficult on all of us. To have that healing presence of God in our midst is really important. And that's what we ask people. We invite people to be part of our mission in that way.
And Eleanor, I know you can't talk about specifics exactly, but in general terms, how has that that increased the pressure on clinicians with COVID? Are they dealing with more situations in which they have that moral dilemma, or they have to balance their emotions with their work?
Well, judging by the calls and the requests that we're receiving, it has heightened people's awareness of the moral dimension of their work, for sure. We're getting requests or calls from people that maybe we didn't know that we had influence over. I'm hearing from new areas of clinical work, and so I think that there's just an overall, people are now, I think it's because the choices we have to make are quite stark, right? They're quite stark in comparison to previously. And I think that has upped the conversation, for sure.
What are those choices? Whether to let family members in, or what are the types of choices that?
Yeah. Well, and I think the idea of reserving beds in a facility, like to reserve those for COVID-19, that's an issue of stewardship when there's a pressure to have. There's just generally a pressure there. So, it leads to questioning about why are we doing this? That's, just one area. Certainly it comes back to the visitor restrictions over and over again, to be honest. And I think that's what has taught us all how we're connected. It's taught us that there's not just the physical aspects of being a clinician and caring for someone's body, but it has turned people towards, yes, in Covenant Health we talk about mind, body, and spirit, and I think people now are going, oh, okay, that's what we mean here, because it's not just caring for this person in this way, but see how the seniors are being affected by not having visitors, how their mental health is impacted there. The lack of religious services is another area that's really difficult.
Two other examples come to mind that really play on that. Early in our COVID response, there's a lot of concern from staff, clinicians, et cetera, on PPE. So not only getting timely access to it, having the adequate amount of supplies, but the sufficient level of safeguard. And there was this good debate about what, is an N95 a minimum, or is a surgical mask, appropriate in most other cases, except if they're aerosol generating procedures. So the issue around the duty to care, we have a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility to provide care. We can't abandon people. But at the same time, as you were saying, Eleanor, our staff have families. They were, we saw during SARS back in the early 2000s, where some staff didn't want to go home because they didn't want to risk exposing their loved ones. And we saw that play out here. And that's why there was demand for sleep rooms, and then making sure we have adequate other basic necessities like food, so that people can actually, have a hot meal and have a place to lay their head, overnight when they're working, when they were doing call, etc. So So the question around like PPE was huge. And now with the school reopening, a lot of our staff have families, school-age children. And then where those boundaries are, because of if all of a sudden, they are exposed or their children are exposed, that might have implications about their availability for work. And then so maintaining an adequate workforce, because we still have people coming in, having babies, having cancer, injuring themselves, etc. So we still have to maintain that workforce, but that puts a lot of pressure on our staff who are trying to balance competing duties.
How do they resolve that?
Pardon me?
How do they resolve those?
Well, I think a lot of it is consistent messaging. So we will talk, and maybe Patrick might emphasize that we talk, as Eleanor was saying, like it's body, mind, and soul, like the whole person. It's not just whole person care for the people we serve, but our staff are also holistic beings who have other needs and families, etc. And so if we kind of approach our patients with one approach, but we are insensitive to our staff's realities. And by staff, I mean our clinicians and our other staff. But we're insensitive to the reality, that will create that moral anguish and injury that we're trying to prevent. So if you look at it from a preventative point of view, let's not compound the challenges. We need to support our staff and be flexible. So the other flexibility we see, this is around workspace. I'm in my office right now. I can tell Eleanor's at her home and all that, but you have to be reasonable with our staff. And yet at the same time, we can't ignore our patient needs. And so it's trying to just constantly be in dialogue, lots of communication, lots of reassurance, presence, virtual in the most part for those that aren't working who aren't always at the clinical settings. But it's just trying to acknowledge staff's needs and being reasonable, working together with our unions, working together with our professional associations, and we're all trying to figure this out together. The other thing is that some people are being impacted economically. Certainly some physicians, because there's less volume of, at one point the hospital was, look at the MIS, at one point we were down to, probably about 50 or 60 patients during the outbreak. So there are some implications for some of our staff and clinicians from an economic point of view with the single site restrictions, where we're trying to limit the movement of people working at one facility and at another facility and yet another facility. Well, the reality is some of our staff, particularly when it comes to healthcare aides or other positions where they might work multiple jobs. They only have like a part-time role at one facility and a part-time role. And if all of a sudden with the single site restrictions where they had to kind of choose their primary site, that impacted them economically. So those are the things that we've been trying to be sensitive and supportive of and advocating for our staff and because we do know that multiple transfers, multiple movement increases the risk of exposure. So we're just trying to work in step with all that. And again, as new information comes to light, it would be, changing daily, sometimes even on an hourly basis, when we'd be getting updates from the medical officer of health and then having to implement that. And then all of a sudden we're telling our staff, okay, from starting today, we're going to be doing it this way. That requires a lot of information, a lot of support, a lot of communication with our staff, and just trying to settle their anxiety and understanding why we're needing to do this.
You had people oversight, Gordon. We were very intentional by creating a group called People Oversight Committee to assemble everybody to think about how do we care for our staff? How do we care for our people who are continuing to serve patients?
Yeah, the mental health impact, But we also taught, like the people oversight committee that Eleanor is referring to, was just, it was looking at all the wellness, the spiritual care, the organizational development, ethics, all those chaplaincy, all those supports that we have. But also we were not afraid to name issues that people were thinking and talking about, was what would happen if I died, as I got exposed in the course of fulfilling my duties and died. What is the reciprocal support we provide their surviving family members? That's a sobering conversation, but I can tell you a lot of people thought that. And just yesterday, I saw there was a young physician that I thought in Canada. I was on Twitter, and somebody that I follow who put forward this story, but of a young physician that died. I think she was an OBGYN. So that is a reality, and yeah.
Died of COVID, this the physician you're talking about?
Yeah, it's on. It's sure you'd find it on somewhere on the media and all that. But it was trying to, as Eleanor was saying, like providing as much support for our staff, and they really stepped up. Like we really, the public, it really needs to hear and know and how much. Not only healthcare workers, but a lot of essential workers, from people who pick up your garbage to, people working at grocery stores. And often, because they're interacting with the public, just think about the next time you go to Safeway. You're one customer, but how many customers will they see in the course of their shift who will be in close proximity to them, and the fears that they might have in terms of being exposed, so the risk of exposure, the fears associated with that, requires us to provide a lot of support. And I'd say, hey, Eleanor, that we've got a lot of public support for healthcare workers, and even when there are things in the news about outbreaks, there's always some sort of comments that don't always understand the reality, but for the most part, I think people are pretty fair and understanding. And our only appeal is that it's not just healthcare workers; it's a lot of people who help society continue on.
And Eleanor, people don't realize the pressures on doctors, workers within Covenant facilities. They just assume that when they go to a hospital, they're going to be taken care of, whether it's COVID or not.
Yeah, they do. And I think that one of the things, I'm not sure if this is one thing I want to say about that too, is that you come as a patient, as an individual, and we have been very privileged in Canada to have that trust that we're going to be cared for as an individual. And we think that, that trust is there, but what we have learned certainly and has come forward is that not everyone trusts us. Not everybody trusts us. People bring their histories, their sort of experiences, that sort of thing. And I guess we're coming to see now how tenuous the trust can be, especially for racialized groups in this time of COVID. So never making the assumption that someone's going to be willing to receive our care on our side. And people coming in, one of the things that early on happened was that people who needed to come to the emergency department were not coming because they were afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, that's a trust issue. How do we overcome that so that people come? I mean, there were, a drop in the number of people arriving at the emergency department with heart attacks in progress, and that's really serious.
Yeah.
Can each of you talk a little bit about what is the mood at Covenant? Is it is it a high pressure environment because of COVID? And also, are there any lessons to be learned once there's a vaccine and things kind of get back to normal? Gordon, maybe can I get you to start? What's the mood?
Well, it's been if you think back to March to today in September, I'd say things have changed so much. So what might have been very upsetting or a particular snapshot of the mood in March would look different today. I'd say there is concerns right now with fall and in influenza season, almost upon us, and whether or not the other shoe is going to drop. There's a little bit of that concern, and I think that's a very legitimate concern. And as we start seeing rise in numbers and now some jurisdictions kind of cutting back on the number of the size of public gatherings, it's an indication that we're not over it. And so I think there's a bit of a bracing yourself kind of tone or sentiment out there. At the other hand, I think healthcare workers it's the unknown that sometimes that can be the most upsetting. And so we have 6 months under our belt, and there's outbreaks all the time, all over the place, in AHS covenant facilities around the world. Like you're going to see outbreaks. Outbreaks are going to be part of a reality going forward. But we're really good at responding to it, with all the resources and the protocols around contact tracing, et cetera. So I think that in one hand, we feel more prepared, more experienced. And when it comes to, at some future date around vaccines, that will introduce new concerns in terms of the prioritization of who gets the vaccine first, the safety, the efficacy. These aren't new issues, because year after year, you would know some people are first in line to get a vaccine and some will never get a vaccine for some of the very same reasons. So we'll manage that as we have done. So I'd say the tone is we probably lean on a strategy or an approach of an abundance of caution. And that doesn't mean that we're fearful. It just means that we're very cautious. We don't want to open things up prematurely. But if we shut down everything, and Eleanor, that was a great example about if people are not trusting the system or feeling like they can't go to the hospital to deliver their baby, or that if they're having a cardiac event, not to go to the emergency department, that's going to cause more harm. So we need to keep our doors open, and we need to send that message out to the community that it's safe and that we can provide care and there's good, compassionate people. So I think there's still a sense of pride and confidence, but there's an overlay of caution though too.
And Eleanor, I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier. How many calls would you receive in a given time period prior to COVID? How has that increased? And the calls that you do receive when you talk to a clinician, how do you help them work through that moral dilemma? What do you say to them when?
So regarding the statistics on that, up until this time, we were seeing a steady increase year over year. Just as we, increase our profile and our influence. So up until COVID, we were receiving on average a little over one consult a week. So 52, more like 60 in a year. So it was steady. It wasn't, unfortunately, it's not scheduled like that. Sometimes they come in clusters, right? But that's what we know. We haven't done our stats for this year, but our perception is that we've had more. For instance, there was a 2-week period, and I remember this vividly because Gordon and my colleague John were away, and in a 2-week period, I received 6 consults, and on one particular day, 3 of those were clustered on one day. Mm-hmm. So yes, and it's a good thing. Like it's a good thing that we get called. What we can't capture is the influence that we've had through our committee members or the physicians who've worked with us before who now have been equipped to deal with a moral dilemma on their own. So we have no way of knowing that. We just hope that that's occurring, right? So and the second part of your question was what?
What is there a lesson to be learned from COVID once the dust settles, so to speak? How will healthcare be changed?
Well, I think as one of the things that my colleague John and I reflect on is first that we see areas where people are well equipped to have the conversations, the conversations about moral dilemmas, etc. And that's a wonderful thing. And we feel that we have intentionally equipped particular people through our provincial on-call ethics team. We've been intentional about that and meeting with them every 2 weeks so that we sort of we can deploy people more quickly. Mm-hmm. That's a very useful thing. So yeah.
I would add, Eleanor, that sometimes we see a lag between the precipitating event or the issue and then the ethics consult. Sometimes it takes a while for people to come to realize that this is not sitting very well. And so to be precise, Eleanor and John and I, we would participate with our colleagues across the country within the Catholic Health Alliance of Canada. There's an ethics network. And we saw similar patterns where there was with the, a lot of decision making was elevated at a provincial level. So you have medical officers of health, and these are the directives and ministerial orders and then, so there were certain things that even the organization didn't have control over. And then so it wasn't like the team was needing to determine what we should do. We had to do it. But then all of a sudden, after you start seeing the implications of that, having to deal with, like, as we talked about, people around visit restrictions, that's when some of the consults started to kind of occur. But I would say that in some respects, because it was a command and control structure, and again, this is across the country, that it's only now, sometime later, that, right now, like Eleanor's not, overstating it, but a lot of the calls and the interest and the education around moral distress. So I think it takes a while. You just try to get clinicians, like when somebody falls down, has a heart attack, we just rush to the scene. Like that's what we're trained to do. We're very good at that. But it's later on when you realize, while I rushed to the scene and took care of that individual, I had to kind of leave this other patient or whatever. And it's when you start looking at like the implications of our response and knowing that maybe we weren't able to care for all equally in that time period, or that in caring for this individual that it may have been sort of rubbed us the wrong way because of the context, that's when some of that residue kind of starts kicking in. It's sort of like the plutonium, it has a half-life, and the getting through a crisis is one thing, but recovering from it is a whole nother chapter. And we see that through, whether you're talking about like Katrina, if you think about how many years later after Hurricane Katrina hit, and even after they rebuilt the levees in New Orleans, the community was rebuilding trust. And especially when it comes to, as you said, Eleanor, when it comes to the disproportionate impact on some racialized minorities. And that if that's another thing that COVID has brought attention to is the issue around racism, and so that's more work for us in the healthcare system and in the church to deal with. And I was happy to see that in the bishop's pastoral letter they acknowledge the issue of systemic racism. And Pope Francis talks about like two viruses sweeping the world. There's the obvious COVID, but there's also this virus of indifference. And I think we're beginning to see about who's, needing to bring attention to why some individuals are more impacted than others. And so anyway, sometimes there's a lag, but now we're beginning to kind of like come to terms with a lot of that.
Eleanor, how does that, when you mentioned racialized communities, how does that manifest itself exactly? That some people who are racialized minority, they choose not to go to hospital because I'm not sure. I was kind of a little bit unclear on how that manifests itself exactly.
Yeah, well, within certain communities, we have a large Indigenous population in Alberta. People have experienced so many interactions in their lives that have not gone well, right? And then they come to the hospital, so they're already armed with the sort of stories that they've had about how they've been treated or how their mother had been treated or that sort of thing, or just the microaggressions that occur every day. I had an Indigenous student live with me, and finally I said to her one day, Lindsay, you're just, it's like you've got your dukes up all the time. And, then sort of having the story fall out that, well, I'm followed around stores, I'm blah, 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 all those kinds of things. When I go to the health unit, they think I'm drug seeking, so people in communities like the First Nations communities have this accumulation. Also, of course, for us as a church, it's difficult, right? So we're Catholic health. So what does that mean to the average person coming to us? I had a medical student ask me if he had to be Catholic in order to work in Covenant Health. And, I had to explain to him what we mean by the mission and, the invitation that we extend. So, yeah, there's some misunderstandings there, but we deal with it all the time. We have, some of our patients, some of our elders come in and they're being cared for by a person from, say, a person from the West Indies. They've never, this is a person now who's going to be doing very personal care for this senior, and they've never had interactions with people of color. You can imagine that if you're fragile elder and, you come from Cold Lake to Edmonton and now this is just really difficult, right? And it leads sometimes to some really difficult and hurtful interactions on both sides.
Is there a good thing that can come out of this, or some sort of areas in which COVID has maybe exposed a weakness that can be strengthened post-pandemic?
Oh, well, we have a colleague, Megan Ellis, who is bringing together, she leads our Diversity and Inclusion Council, and so she's been overwhelmed by requests for information about how better to interact with people, how to resolve these sorts of things. And so I work with Megan, and Gordon does too. So maybe Gordon, you might want to speak to some of the things that Megan has got going.
Well, and just in general, Megan, we've had for years, for years we've had a diversity inclusion committee that has evolved to a council. So we've been dealing with issues of this nature for a long, long time. But if you're in response to your question, what's good that's come out of it is the spotlight that's now on issues of systemic racism and how that might manifest itself. And we're preparing a call to action statement. So a lot of the critique that's out there is that everybody's quick to put forward a statement, and it's essentially words. But how does it translate in terms of actions about how we hire, promote? Does our board reflect the communities that we serve, et cetera, et cetera? And then, as a Catholic church, we talk about the dignity, and I know for this week's reflection, it's on the dignity of the human person and the intrinsic and incalculable worth of every human being, and we certainly see that. But is experienced the same by all people? So for a person who's transgendered, would they say the same thing in terms of their interaction with Covenant, whether as a staff member or as a patient? Women, healthcare is predominantly led by a lot of women leaders on our board, on our senior team, in our workforce. But would all women feel that same sense of respect? I'm not going to answer this question for you, Eleanor, but do women all feel that same sense of inclusivity as a Catholic ministry? So I think it's turned a spotlight and a rallying cry. So Megan and I are leading a multidisciplinary grand rounds in about 3 weeks. And so the physicians asked for this. So they're engaged, and our senior team, our board. So there's a real sense of being able to say, how we've kind of managed or talked about diversity and inclusion historically is no longer sufficient. We need to see some demonstrative action steps in terms of how we're going to address that. And we don't know the answer. We don't know what we don't know. We need to find that out, but we're committed to that path. So I'm really proud of that. I think that's a really important journey, a new step. And I would look back that it was COVID that really sort of turned that spotlight. And again, we're not unique. You can see this in the throughout the world.
And just as a final question, the panel focuses on the inherent dignity of human life. What has the experience of COVID taught you, Eleanor, and Gordon, you personally, and Covenant Health as an organization? What has that taught all of you about the inherent dignity of human life? Maybe Eleanor, I'll start with you.
Yeah, clinically, I think that in the clinical ethics arena, what I end up having conversations about what do we mean by dignity. I think we look at it comes up in the consults now even more because of the restrictions. So can we? Examples would be, we have young people who are in continuing care, residential care, because of accidents like that result in traumatic brain injury or spinal cord injury, and they're now living with us and will for decades to come. So what kind of limitations do we put on their visiting, on their going outside and then coming back in the facility? These are all things about what the conversations around, well, this person already is especially vulnerable. How do we protect the public? You know, it's again that common good versus for the individual. Well, when we recognize this person already has had so much taken away from them, and usually our focus is on flourishing. Usually our focus is on helping people to have autonomous choice. And now we're kind of having to back that up, but always keeping in mind whatever action that we take is dignity preserving. You know, so there's a lot of discussion about, is this an action that we can take among the options that still holds the dignity of that individual? So clinicians are well aware of that, particularly the ones who are have long relationship in our long-term care facilities and continuing care.
And I would just add, just from a labor point of view, just the dignity of healthcare workers, like the dignity of, it's a noble profession and a calling, and it comes with roles and responsibilities and privileges. But I think COVID has really reminded us about how important this work is, and that we need to support those who are giving of themselves for the betterment of their fellow human being. And if you think of the context, I mean, not to get down the sideline or side conversation around the relationship with the physicians and the government has probably been at an all-time low. And so a lot of people feeling unappreciated, not supported, etc. And so I think if there's a message of dignity that we need to lift up, it's just that the Ministry of Healthcare, it's a beautiful and a noble profession, and we need to support these individuals for what they do, but we also need to support our staff and their reality and how their dignity may be sort of challenged at times, and how can we best support and protect it because of their own vulnerability. And that, so I would just kind of, I would add that kind of perspective around as far as your question, Andrew.
And Catholic social teaching, it guides your work for each of you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
How does it do that?
Oh, how? Sorry, I missed that.
No problem.
Oh, just in terms of just the, people deserve, when you think about the preferential option for the poor, for the vulnerable, there are certainly the vulnerable seniors and those that are maybe at greatest risk for exposure to COVID. There's also the vulnerability that a healthcare worker may experience. So we need to kind of ensure that we're addressing both. As a good employer, people need to have a voice in decision making in terms of participatory voice, their right to associate. So all those sort of good, well-established labor practices that have roots or that Catholic social teaching has commented on and called us to. So justice in the workplace, etc. And of course, human dignity, as we've talked about. So there's, and again, this is a good opportunity because people might hear the word Catholic social teaching. I mean, you and Eleanor and I might know a bit about that. People might not use those words on the point of care at the front line, so to speak. But when you listen to their stories, a lot of them speak to where Catholic social teaching is being lived or not. And so if people feel like they're not provided the adequate supports, whether it's PPE, sleep, food, etc., reciprocity in terms of if they got ill, they will speak out about that. And yet, when we look at ourselves as a Catholic ministry, we know that we have a moral obligation, moral duty to ensure that our staff are safe, and it's driven not just because we should be doing it, but from some, because government's telling us or somebody else. It's part of our DNA. And that DNA is really around Catholic social teaching, our mission, our values, and that. So, and I mean, the sisters taught us that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, just, I participated in, I was brought into a consult that it just, had to do with the service that we provide in long-term care, and there were feelings among the staff that the quality of care that they were so proud of had eroded when everything just went crazy in March. But what was incredible about that was that it was one clinician who spoke up. She represented her, she represented the voice of others, and it was something that not necessarily in her wheelhouse, so to speak. If in some organizations they would say that's really not your stuff, right? But she felt, because she's very committed to the social justice and the holding that up, that she took it forward, this concern that she had in a continuing long-term care setting, and she took it to ethics, and then she brought it to the site, and it was so wonderful because the response wasn't, it came from that sort of grassroots level, but there was no sort of authority taken away from her, right? That's an important piece. There was no authority taken away from her or her colleagues, but rather there was engagement. And so there were conversations that I participated in, and it was a really good example of people pulling together to make a solution, to say, okay, going forward, if we're under shutdown again, we now know we're going to make it through this. And so I just, we have a hierarchy that we have to, hierarchy is the way that things get done. But this was such a good example of sort of like a circle coming together to address an issue. It was fantastic.